Retail is facing a complex market environment right now with rising costs, more channels to manage, and a consumer who a year ago was flush with stimulus money but now is dialing down spending in the face of rising inflation. What can retailers do to get ahead of market conditions and position themselves to triumph? I'm Jane Singer, and thank you for taking the time to join me here on A Seat at the Table, where we talk to leading executives, entrepreneurs, and innovators who share their insights, experience, and outlook on business, technology, and leadership. It's wonderful to have you as part of our international community that now includes industry professionals like you in over 100 countries. Today I'm speaking with Carl Boutet, founder, chief strategist, and executive advisor at Studio RX, where he advises senior retail leaders and brands on how to build better business strategies that leverage their combined choices of technology, analytics, and design. His master recipe for success: measure, analyze, predict, prescribe. In this episode of A Seat at the Table, Carl talks about why retailers need to shift their focus from managing cash flows to now putting more emphasis on resource allocation, how to leverage the power of physical stores in everything from customer acquisition to community building, and the value of integrating upstream and downstream data to have better clarity on inventories and better product information to provide customers. Before we get started, if you are a supply chain executive who'd like to finally put an end to information overload and get a concise, fact-based summary of key market developments and shifts, as well as sharp insights into what's likely to impact sourcing in the coming months, then the current situation in sourcing is exactly what you're looking for. To learn more, head on over to thecurrentsituation.net. That's thecurrentsituation.net, where you can get all of the details. Now let's sit down with Carl and find out how retailers can outrun today's new market conditions. Carl, I'm really happy to have you on the show, and I think that right now, as we're coming out of the pandemic, there's a lot happening at retail. So we're coming out of an era where people were shopping like mad because they had nothing else to do. So they were shopping online. And now we're in an era where suddenly we see this huge obstacle looming: inflation. What do you think retailers should be doing differently? Or are there different strategies or tactics that they should be considering implementing now?
Yeah. There's no, obviously, like everything else in life, there's no silver bullet for one solution fixes everything. It's a question, really. I think there's a couple of axes you got to consider if you're looking to deal with the inflationary pressure, especially inflationary pressures, and how they impact discretionary spending. So if you're essential or non-essential right out of the gate, makes a difference in how you're positioning yourself. If you're luxury or low consideration or very commoditized is another sort of axis you want to consider, because those will have major impacts. Although there's no playbook for this perfect storm that's been brewing for quite a while. I mean, people are sort of talking about inflation all of a sudden. I mean, I've been sort of from my soapbox since last summer. I sit on some boards where I was just looking at the 10x cost and increase in container shipping, and I think, like, how could that not translate to increased cost of goods? Everything comes in on containers, and then with all the money that was being flooded in. So the inflationary playbook right now is it's all about resource allocation internally. So where I think they're going back to the fundamentals of being very conscious of resource allocation, where it is and why differentiate in the market. I wrote a book called The Great Acceleration. So the pandemic, played a big part in shifting some consumer behaviors and digitizing the path to purchase in large part. So that continues. That hasn't changed. But it doesn't necessarily mean the ROI is the same as some other more physical channels. And again, it goes back to where you are in the spectrum of discretionary to essential, luxury to commodity, and where you're going to want to how you're going to want to differentiate in those different circumstances. So the allocation can be increased in digital if that's where you can stand out and make a difference. Although cognizant that the business model is much harder.
Right.
The variables around logistics and returns, or reverse logistics and returns, still plays a huge downward effect on that in a time where cost of capital is increasing and even availability of capital might be more constrained. So there's, again, a lot of factors, but it doesn't change the fact that the consumers are still there. The sort of the new dynamic, I think, very conscious of the 2008 recession when we were seeing 14% inflation and interest rates back in the early 80s. But I think the X factor right now is, thankfully, in most parts of the world, salary is matching what is discretionary, what is available. Although the essential good costs around food and and energy are definitely going to put a lot of strain on those. Added to the fact that they have some overstock inventory issues too. So that's why I said it's a perfect storm with a lot of new variables that everybody's learning to manage.
So given that it is a perfect storm, and if you're looking more at discretionary goods, what should retailers be doing differently now? What should they be thinking about? I mean, right now the conversation is really focusing around raising prices because costs for retailers have gone up across many, many different inputs. We know that logistics have become more expensive, but there is the conversation that some of that might be becoming less expensive, but certainly raw materials have gone up. Wages, particularly frontline workers, have gone up. What should retailers be thinking to be doing to get ahead of this situation as best they can?
So, I mean, first of all, I don't think there's a variable that the prices haven't increased. There's no primaries that are, where there's been a savings for anybody, be it transportation, labor, logistics, primary materials, everything is so there's and especially when you get, it's become structural. When it's things like salary, there's no going back. We're not going to be reducing salaries after this, right? So, I mean, I'm not an economist. We've been talking a lot about economics the last little while because we all had to brush up on our supply chain as well. But all these factors. Now, back to your question, what can retailers that are more focused on discretionary? I mean, it's really, I think inventory management is going to become a big issue. As I just mentioned, there is a problem or a challenge in a lot of markets because of the supply chain delays. They received in a lot of stock that was supposed to be there 3-4 quarters ago, and they're out of whack in terms of their, especially for seasonal, those that have some seasonality built into them. So, if I'm overflooded in swimsuits right now and I got to start preparing for Q4 and any winter. And it's not, you say we're coming out of the pandemic. I mean, I obviously certainly hope so, but we're not done with these pains of, the ports are still all backed up. I think we're going to have the same issue we had late, hopefully be better prepared, but I'm not sure that we had late last summer on the West Coast where, all our ports couldn't deal with the volume. So more delays, more cost increases. So as a retailer, during the pandemic, I think we were focused on managing cash flows, which was great. That's always there. I think now it's really going to be around inventory management and making sure that our buying is going to have to be, there's going to be no margin for error. Like it's going to have to be, I almost say, you want to leverage we're talking about leveraging data all the time. I mean, that's always there, but the problem now is the data points are shifting, and I don't know if the historics are really representative right now to help us sort of navigate these waters. We have in the industry lingo, we have an old metric called GMROI, which is gross margin return on investment. Okay. I mean, that's sort of a fundamental measure that a lot of retailers kind of some still use it. It's, a secondary sort of data point. It might want to become a primary because it comes back to inventory turns and how quickly you're moving goods at what margin. And so I think that maybe going back and revisiting some of those basic principles will be critical. And then how you invest your dollars in terms of promoting this product right now, and digital channels are not getting any cheaper. So have to be again very strategic, and there's some lessons around that I think that we can unpack a bit more, and how do we differentiate in the market on on the go side, not just the back end, which has been where our primary concerns have been over the last 2.5 years. Now it's I got to get back to being very strategic in my investments and how I communicate and engage with the customers.
Yeah, I think that everybody is trying to think about managing so many different points, and yet at the same time, they're different than what they had a year ago or even 6 months ago that they had to face.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's a question. I think we got to do more with what we have. So, I think we need to leverage our workforces more. We got to leverage our frontline workers. And I say leverage meaning we got to make sure that they're fully utilized. If we got to empower them with some digital tools to make sure that they can engage directly with customers in whichever way. I think we got to get away from what the pandemic sort of brought us, this spray and pray approach in digital marketing, where I'm just going to, put a bunch of money, sort of spread it out into different channels and see what works, what doesn't work. I think now we got to be a lot more selective in those investments at the same time as we're managing our inventories and our cash flows. And the other factor through this, Jane, too, is that's new again is we're in a full employment scenario. So it's as a business leader and somebody whose primary responsibilities are strategic and resource allocation, you got to get focused really quick on what matters and where your return on investments are going to come from, or your best return on investments are going to come from. And historically, that's been the people you hire and the tools you leverage. So that's not going to change. It's just where and how you use them is what the critical point is in this environment right now, where everybody's trying to navigate and differentiate.
So what you're saying is that people need to perhaps narrow their focus. Instead of being in every channel, perhaps pick a few or even one that they feel could be the best possible one for them and really go deep on that, as opposed to, being narrow and wide.
Yeah. And the other thing too is I think, we've, as an industry, and this is the business models behind the digital media platforms, is, you basically have to pay to play. And the cost of playing is increased exponentially, especially with the pandemic. So I think the idea of going back to more organic channels, thinking even about how you leverage your physical footprint more, coming back to how do you leverage your front line and the engagement they can create directly with the customers without having to spend tons money in social digital channels to hopefully engage with the right customer. So that focus back, I've been a big proponent, Jane, for years around community building. And whenever I talk to especially new emerging brands, I think the playbook has sort of become build the community first and then worry about the product next, right? You got to sort of find your quote unquote, your tribe.
Right.
And go, build on that. The same way you're doing with your medium here, you got to find your resources. I'm sure are also not unlimited. You have to sort of find the people that sort of with who your message is going to resonate the most. So the retailers is the same thing. They got to find, if you're a mass merchant or that's a bit of a different equation, and they usually have the resources to deal with that. Even if they're legacy. But the new emerging brands out there, it's all about community. It's all about building and sort of this organic relationship where I don't have to pay you to get your attention. I just bring you good quality content. And that content can be a product, it can be a service, it can be a value add that I do above and beyond the product and service. But everything I can do to sort of make a difference, I think that is going to return that return on investment is going to be probably richer than just dumping money into digital social channels.
I think it's really interesting that you point that out, because in a sense, and I'm not saying everybody, but there was a very big shift away from that personal engagement, particularly at physical retail, right? Everybody went to the e-commerce platforms where you naturally had less community and less interaction with your customers because it was an online purchase. And now they're finding that, it is very, very expensive, like you're saying, to get people's attention through social media. But up until just recently, it was really social media, digital or bust. And the stores are almost considered to be a burden, right?
Yeah, well, we were seeing that shift a bit, before the pandemic already, when all these we call them digital native vertical brands, the DNVBs, were starting to open stores because they recognized that the customer acquisition costs were exploding. So the American brands like Warby Parker and Casper and all these sort of the poster children for that era were all moving quickly to physical because they recognized the customer acquisition costs in physical was lower than in digital. They had more organic reach by these things called stores.
Right.
And they were brand builders. And especially if your brand differentiated, was trying to differentiate with some sort of richer sort of content connection like Warby Parker would, you needed the store. There's always, the digital can only get you so far. But we still know, let's not fool ourselves, Jane, into thinking that the path to purchase is any less digital than it was. I mean, the majority of transactions still, especially in non-discretionary, is, the digital touch points sort of are always where the path to purchase begins, and then majority converts still in physical. Even during the pandemic, 70% were still converting physical. So, it's just finding that right balance. Just hopefully you don't have to pay extraordinary amounts of money to get those first digital touch points out there, and that comes back to engaging with the customer and having something relevant to say that reaches an audience or people who your messages chances are going to resonate more with. So it's becoming a challenge. Plus, I don't even get into the whole the death of the cookies and how third-party data is going to become harder and harder to deal with, as an industry that was very much dependent on that third-party data. How do you build first-party data is, just doing what I mentioned, engaging directly, giving a good reason why your customers should care and want to sort of engage directly with you versus just promotional digital ad spend.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of retailers are trying to maybe reevaluate, is to see what do we do next and where can we get the best return for all of our efforts, whether it be digital marketing or human resources or other resource utilization. It seems that as soon as people feel like they figured it out, everything changes again.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that I don't say struggling might be, I don't know if it's the right word, but we've come to a point with leveraging so much of these digital channels that we've become accustomed to really being able to track and measure that return. CMOs would have a real hard time making investments in any sort of channels where they can't get very granular around their measurement, which makes physical channels more difficult. But we're seeing a lot of investments in technologies that are helping retailers better track the path to purchase in physical so they can see where those returns are coming from. And we're trying to sort of layer on the whole digital toolkit to the physical so that we can properly see where the attribution's coming from and saying, okay, well, these dollars that I put into fixturing in the store or digital, or any sort of advertising in the physical environments, digital or analog, what is my return on investment on those? Whereas that famous quote from the Mad Men era of we know that 50% of advertising works, we just don't know which 50%. Those
Right.
days are over. That's why there's so much turnover in the CMO world. You're only as good as your ROI in the marketing world. So if you're spending money that you can't attribute back and show direct correlation to business success, that's something that's not going to change. As much as we need to reinvest in organic and community-based and build sort of that direct relationship, it's not going to happen if we can't measure it.
Yeah, I think that's really one of the biggest challenges, because you can become addicted to being able to measure everything. And it's important, but at the same time, there are things that you can't really measure that way, and yet that play a very big role. And a lot of that, like you said, is community. A lot of that is the connection you build with that customer that keeps them coming back, that enables you to sort of understand better what they may want or not want. And that's very difficult to measure, particularly over a short period of time, whereas with other things, you can measure it literally on a day-by-day basis.
Colleagues in data science would push back on that probably and say there's a solution to measure pretty much anything these days, from psychographics to all these other. When we'll go deep down the neuroscience rabbit hole, but but you're right. I mean, it is hard, and there are some very good business thinkers that are pushing back on this whole what gets measured gets done, and all that
Right.
sort of school of thought, where they say culture, for instance, is hard to measure.
Yeah.
A strong company culture, and that sort of, which we know delivers results. But how you measure it. But you can come back still, Jane, to sort of the basic, net promoter score sort of systems already that can still give you some sort of a compass around how you're doing with some of the other more analog. I wouldn't personally be too over dependent on that. I think there's some shortcomings in that. There's some other tools, including one that I have in my book where I talk about the retail relevance index, sort of as an expansion on that promoter score to include sort of these other attributes that would sort of help you understand where you're differentiating so that people would promote you, but based on what? Not just on the fact that they like you, but why do they like you?
Right.
So I think we got to get closer and closer to that. And we have more and more tools to intercept and understand that, and in physical as in digital. So we're trying to leverage that more and more.
So what tools do you feel that perhaps people are not using? In other words, you said there's a lot of tools and people are using some of those tools. Are there tools that you feel that people should be paying more attention to or should be utilizing more? We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
I mean, I'm a big fan of any tool that sort of bridges the physical digital divide. I've been talking for almost a decade now, the blurring of physical and digital, and how those two are coming to a point where we're going to have a harder and harder time telling them apart. But we still clearly live in a world where we see them as discrete. But the tools are there more and more to sort of blend that. And it could be things like RFID or even QR codes. While all through Asia, everybody was using them very efficiently. We didn't. Now we found a way to start reusing them again. So these tools that are these contact points allow us to jump in between physical and digital worlds, I think is very important because they allow us to capture and contextualize information at specific points and in the path to purchase. So is it, as I first begin to engage with a product in a physical setting, a very specific physical setting? Is it as I'm exiting, as I've made the purchase? So I'm excited about those tools. I do some work with some companies in that space specifically. And then anything that sort of empowers the front line to another place that I've been doing more and more work is about leveraging that critical asset, human capital asset that we have, that's that passionate frontline person that really is engaged and feels strongly about what it is they're selling, and giving them all the tools they need to amplify that, so that we're not just using that, capturing that passion at that specific location at that specific time, where we can use clienteling tools, we can use frontline training tools. There's a lot of things we can do to sort of push that out, and not just say, well, that passionate brand advocate that we have working for us in our store, we can only leverage that when a customer walks up to them. How can we go beyond that and leverage that talent and that passion beyond what's happening in the physical space?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think that probably we're being forced now, because of rising costs and because of inflation, to really, really drill down on how we can better utilize what we've got, as you've been pointing to here, that it's challenging people to really narrow that focus and get maximum utilization.
That's the key word. You just said it. I mean, maximum utilization in a, let's be careful not to, overdo it and create, like we want to empower, basically. We just want to empower. And there's a notion in economics of slack, where there's a sort of some wastage all the time, where we got to be very, we got to reduce that as much as possible by create value, but we don't want to, we don't want to crush either. So we got to find that balance, and meaning I don't want to take that passionate, frontline, talented workforce and turn them into 24/7 robots. We got to find the right way. But I think we're pretty good at generally speaking to find that balance, but just make sure they have the tools. One of the biggest frustrations, and this is again past decade at least, often the customer is more empowered than the employee. The customer walks in with more tools at their disposal than the people that are supposed to be representing the brand. So how do we level that playing field? How do we give them the tools and help them leverage? Because often we develop these tools for the customers, and it's the employees that are using them because they're like, hey, these are really good solutions that I can use to be better at my work. So even though we did it for the customer at first, we're shifting it back and seeing, okay, let's how. And the way that tool gets used, like I think of a clienteling tool, for instance, is I think much more powerful in the hands of, again, that passionate brand ambassador than necessarily in the hands of the customer.
So how might they use that tool? In other words, the tool was created, as you're saying, for the customer. How might the employee or the shop assistant use that tool?
So, a lot of the investments in digital tools, like in digital technologies in the last 5+ years has been around personalization. So that we were putting in the hands of the customer. But now how can the associate use that to make the shopping experience more relevant for the person that's standing in front of them and said, hey, listen, I just spent plenty of time online looking at all it is you have to offer. Now I'm here with you. So I'm hoping you're going to be able to bring this up to the next level. So how can they maybe leverage that personalization combined with their expertise, hopefully if they're well trained and again, passionate about what they're selling, how can they use those personalization tools? How can they use these tools to also just visibility into the supply chain saying, I'm still floored, Jane, by how many times I'll walk in, especially now with the supply chain issues, walk into major like global retail and product out of stock and they have no idea when or where the product's going to show up next. That visibility, that's going to have to change too. There's going to have to be better integrations around that. So those tools can empower the frontline too and say, okay, we don't have that sweater here in that color in this size right now, but I can get it from another location, or I do know that it should, we have a date here and I can communicate. I'd be happy to communicate with you and send you a personal note once we have it here, or that sort of thing. Okay, I'll cut some slack through the pandemic sort of created a lot of new tensions that we weren't facing before. But we have these tools. It's just visibility and maybe some minor integration investments, but we have these. The people that are running supply chain know this. The people that are managing the stocks know this. So why isn't that information getting to the front line first and then secondly to the customer, but hopefully via that front line?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that there are a lot of different points that retail has to manage these days. But you're right. If they do take a few minutes and sit down and try to figure out where you can get better utilization out of some of these tools, it can make a big impact.
We don't have that leeway to sort of, just marginally use. They have to be fully utilized. And a lot of that comes back to making sure everybody's getting the most out of it from the front line, from the supply chain all the way up to the front line.
Yeah, I think those are really important points. And you shared so many interesting insights here. How can people connect with you? Where can people find you?
Pretty straight. Carl Boutet on LinkedIn is always a pretty easy way to reach out to me. I'm quite responsive there.
Okay.
My website is studiorx.world is my advisory. So if people want to get a better feel for what it is I do at the intersection of sort of technology, data, and design, is how I put it. You can find about that and find out about my book as well, because the book is only sold on my website. I'm not on Amazon and all these other things. It's something that I want to have. I practice what I preach about building community and owning one, direct relationships. So that's all on studiorx.world. But best way to find me, come through LinkedIn and I'll point you in all the right directions.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm going to include that in the show notes. And of course, it'll be over on our website for the podcast as well. I want to thank you so much for taking your time, for sharing all of your wisdom and your experience with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jane.
Thank you for tuning in to A Seat at the Table. If you enjoyed this episode or learned something from it, I'd love to hear about it. Your feedback powers this show. If you'd like to support the show, please hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Also, share episodes you found valuable on LinkedIn or other social media and call out your biggest insight or takeaway from the program. And don't forget to tag me, Jane Singer. I love seeing which episodes you liked best. And if you have time, please leave a review on any of the major podcast channels. Also, don't forget to check out our website, seatpodcast.com. That's SEAT podcast.com. You'll find all kinds of bonus content there, including free ebooks, discounts on apps and other products, as well as a preview of upcoming podcast episodes. You can also send a message with any thoughts, feedback, or suggestions there, and yes, I will read them. Thank you for joining me today and supporting the show. I'm Jane Singer, and I'll see you in our next episode of A Seat at the Table.